Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to let time take us to a place where the bells ring not to celebrate, but to remind us that life is sometimes made of echoes that hurt. Maybe you're listening to this video with the window ajar. Maybe the night air carries a scent that can't be named, like damp dust mixed with forgotten lavender. You know that moment when your body relaxes, but your mind still whispers. That's where our journey begins. Before you go to bed for good, if this kind of story touches something inside you, there are many others that live here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. If you want, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft hum in the background, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Close your eyes if you want. I'll take you there. A time when the breeze brought not only relief, but also the smell of fear. The streets were not paved evenly. They were irregular, alive with footsteps, dust and splashes of a knife that was more body than word. An ordinary day in the year 1320 was woven with the fibers of repetition and cruel surprise. The monk of the monastery woke up to the sound of the bell, yes, but it wasn't the sound of peace. It was the sound that warned that something was about to change, that someone had left, or that the bread that morning was poisoned with silence. The bell was a pulse of metal in the air, a beat that didn't go away once it rang. It stayed, vibrating in the memory. It is hard to imagine the weight of the air at that time, not just the weight of the weather, but the weight of intentions and of what was left unsaid. Silence was a language of its own, and sometimes louder than words. There were no clocks to mark the passing of the hours with precision, but there was the smell of firewood, the sound of chickens, the creak of wooden hinges. All of this told you that the day was beginning, even when your heart just wanted it not to come. Medieval life had no pause. It was a sequence between what had to be done and what could not be avoided. And yet, there was beauty in the way the sun touched the moss, in the way your eyes searched for hope even in the darkest corners of the stones. Perhaps the most striking thing was this, the contrast between the harshness and the involuntary affection. A child covered in dirt offering a piece of bread, a woman singing softly as she lights a candle, a monk writing a psalm without knowing if he would live to finish the line. In 1320, there didn't need to be a war for there to be pain. Sometimes all it took was a body that was too tired to pray, or the fear that the next bell would ring would announce the arrival of the plague. Not a metaphor, the real plague. The one that entered homes like a cold wind and carried people away as if blowing out candles with a single breath. Death was a regular visitor, and no one got used to it, but everyone learned to recognize it from afar. Even so, there were rituals that protected the soul from despair. The gesture of wetting the forehead with holy water, the care taken in folding cloths, the custom of lighting a candle not only to illuminate, but to remind us that there was still light. In the midst of so much sensory chaos, these small acts were anchors, things that said, we are still here, we are still trying. And in the midst of all this, the bell would ring again, sometimes in the distance, sometimes so close that it seemed to beat inside our chest. It was the sound of faith, but also of loss. It was what made everyone stop for a moment, as if time were breathing. Life in 1320 did not have mirrors like those of today, but people knew how to look at themselves. They knew how to recognize the same pain in others, and perhaps that was what made everything more bearable. The invisible sharing, the eyes that did not judge, the hands that held firmly even when they were weak, and the steps, always slow, as if the ground also asked for delicacy, because to step hard was to disrespect those who had fallen before. It was a life of listening, not only to sounds, but to absences, to the empty spaces between one word and another, between one bell and the next. There was a kind of reverence in the way they walked, as if each moment were, in some way, sacred. And perhaps it still is. Perhaps, as we hear this imaginary bell now, here, on this silent night, we are also participating in an ancient ritual of remembering, of feeling, of letting the past tell us its secrets not with shouts, but with whispers, like someone speaking to someone who is almost asleep. And perhaps that is exactly. History does not need to shout to be heard. It just needs us to be willing to listen, calmly, with an open heart, and with that kind of silence that only exists when the soul is tired, but still curious. Have you ever smelled a scent that came from nowhere but seemed ancient, as if it had been stored in a book that had been closed for centuries? The Constantinople of 1320 carried aromas that did not come from flowers or fresh bread. It was a city that still whispered the traumas of what had come before. The Latin massacre of 1204 left more than just wounds on the walls. It left a dense perfume, a kind of dust impregnated with dried blood, burnt wood, and fear.
Survivors said that the smell would not leave their skin or the stones.
It was as if the city were crying from within, a cry that rose with the heat of the sun and spread with the wind.
Monks walked through the alleys, muttering psalms. Sometimes they held cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs close to their faces. It was their way of trying to purify the air,
but also of protecting their hearts. They said that the smell was that of a wounded soul, a collective soul,
and that no one, no matter how holy, could escape from breathing it unscathed.
They recited passages from the book of Psalms as if they were mantras of salvation, and each word sounded more like a lament than a prayer.
Some wept, others just sat on the ground and closed their eyes.
Faith was all that was left when the air was no longer trustworthy. It was as if the air carried not only particles, but memories, as if each breath was a reminder of what the eyes no longer wanted to see.
The burning houses still lived in the invisible smoke of the rooftops. The bodies piled up, even when collected, seemed to still be present. The smell of decomposition was not only physical.
It clung to the fabrics, the pages of the manuscript, the monks' robes.
And even with time, it resisted. The city had been invaded, looted, and desecrated.
And now, it breathed as if trying to relearn how to live.
But there was always something that prevented complete healing.
Something that was in the air.
The reports tell of monks who refused to enter certain wings of the monastery.
They said that the smell there was heavier, that it reminded them of an altar turned upside down.
A desecration of the senses. What should have uplifted them now suffocated them. And the worst part was that no one could escape it. Even closing the doors, the windows, the senses, the smell of pain would pass through. It would find gaps, seep through the cracks, and sit next to them during prayer.
It was as if the city was breathing along with them, and each breath was an attempt to forget, and each breath was an involuntary memory.
There were days when the air seemed cleaner, after the rain, perhaps,
or when the wind blew in from the sea.
But all it took was the sun warming the stones for everything to come back. The heat made memories exude,
not only from the walls, but also from the heart,
because the senses do not forget easily, and smell is the most stubborn of all. A smell can cross centuries. You can wake up what was sleeping.
It can make a monk tremble, even 20 years later,
not with fear,
but with compassion, because to feel that was to remember that many did not return,
and that those who did
were no longer the same.
And what makes an entire city insensitive to mass suffering? Maybe time, maybe the need to survive. Maybe it's as if the body creates a film to protect itself, a thin but resistant layer of indifference, not out of malice, but out of fatigue.
Because feeling everything, all the time, would be unbearable.
So the eyes learn to look away, the hands don't shake, and the nose just gets used to it.
But deep down, the pain is there.
Dormant perhaps, forgotten in the corner of a sacristy.
But a familiar smell is enough to awaken it.
Like a candle that relights only with the warmth of a memory.
Back then, no one talked about trauma
or emotional breakdown.
But there were monks who stopped writing, who were silent for weeks,
who just walked in circles without saying a word. And maybe it all started with the smell.
A scent that seemed to say, here was pain.
Here still hurts. And even when the flowers grew again, there was something in the air that reminded.
An invisible, almost respectful scent.
As if the city itself was asking for forgiveness. And maybe it still does.
Every time the wind blows through the ancient stones and brings with it something you can't name, but you can feel. Imagine a place where the screams cease, but the sound never ends. A monastery hidden among the hills or on the edge of a wounded city became a haven of silence.
But not an empty silence.
It was a full silence.
Dense.
As if every wall breathed along with those who took refuge there. The monks, accustomed to prayers and repetitive routines, knew that sometimes the best thing to do was to say nothing. After an invasion, a massacre, a fire, the most comforting sound was that of absence. The absence of orders, of judgments, of noise.
And so they withdrew, one by one, as if they were slowly disappearing. Some would stay for days without opening their mouths, not out of a vow, but out of necessity. The words seemed too heavy,
as if each syllable could awaken a memory that the heart did not yet know how to deal with.
Others would retreat to individual cells. They took nothing with them, just the clothes on their backs, and sometimes a piece of cloth to cover their eyes. Yes, their eyes. Because there were things that, once seen, could no longer be unseen. And there were days when faith was not enough to erase what was seen. So they would pray in the dark, so that, at least in the shade, their souls could rest a little. The black cloth was an attempt to protect the spirit, like a curtain between reality and the divine. Because not all prayers require light. Some only need silence and darkness. Those who covered their eyes said they felt more intensely, as if the words gained body, smell, and heat. Sitting on cold stones, they murmured names, sometimes of acquaintances, sometimes of enemies, and sometimes just noises that the heart needed to release. It was believed that, by closing his eyes, the monk became part of the invisible, one with the pain, one with the healing,
one with the time that I needed to pass.
Try to imagine this. You are sitting among them,
in a room where light only enters through the high cracks in the windows. Dust dances in the air like particles of memory.
and the only sound is that of others breathing,
A slight creaking of knees. The whisper of an ancient psalm. No one speaks, but everyone says a lot.
because there, in that space suspended between the world and the sky, the language is different. It is made of pauses,
Of contained tears.
of gazes that do not meet,
Because seeing the other is also seeing yourself.
and sometimes that hurts more than any invasion. Silence became a form of sensory protection, like a cloak that envelops without holding you back.
That warms you without suffocating you.
The senses, overwhelmed by images of violence, found shelter in absence.
It wasn't an escape.
It was care,
It was recognizing that the spirit also bleeds.
and that it needs time to recover. The monks knew this, and so they allowed themselves to be silent,
They allowed themselves to just be.
without needing to hear everything at once, without rushing to forget.
Because forgetting too quickly is like sweeping the dust under the altar. Eventually, it will come back.
And the curious thing is that, over time, silence became eloquent.
It said more than sermons. It touched where words could not reach. It was a silence that did not judge, did not demand, did not charge.
It simply welcomed,
And when a new monk arrived, he learned to listen.
not with his ears, but with his entire body. He learned that silence was not absence, it was full presence.
A presence that respects the pain of others, that knows how to wait, that does not force answers,
And that, little by little, rebuilds what was broken, not with speeches.
but with company.
And so the monks continued. Some spoke again,
Others never did, but all of them, in some way, found solace in that soundless ritual. Because there are times when the soul can only reconnect with the sacred when the entire world falls silent.
and perhaps by falling silent here too, even for a few seconds, we can feel a little of that.
An ancient stillness. An inner space where pain can exist without having to scream. And where, who knows, healing begins slowly, with a simple closing of the eyes.
And the silent promise that, despite everything, there is still hope.
The walls did not speak, but they listened,
And inside them, there were monks who watched the world crumble without moving.
hearing the sound of swords outside and the creaking of feathers inside.
The war came like a storm, but it was inside that it caused the most devastation.
The Crusades, from the inside, did not have the shine of promises. They had the smell of blood that was not chosen.
They had the lament of the innocent, and the prayers that tried desperately to separate fanaticism from faith.
Many monks did not fight, but they saw.
They recorded, and this act, apparently simple, was another form of struggle, a silent battle against oblivion. Sometimes the accounts were written in a hurry,
With trembling hands, on stained parchment,
not only with ink,
but with tears.
and sometimes with dried blood that splashed onto the stones of the cloister and reached the scriptorium. There were those who wrote in total silence, and those who murmured words between one line and the next, as if asking permission to continue, because describing the horror was also reliving it.
It was trying to put into words what not even the eyes could hold anymore,
The monk wrote with faith.
but also with pain.
Each sentence was an attempt to organize the chaos that did not fit into prayer.
Some left blank spaces, as if certain scenes could not be told, as if saying something was worse than keeping quiet,
Others recorded everything.
but with a language that seemed like sleepwalking. Metaphors, deviations, symbols.
It was the way they found to keep writing without going mad. The pen trembled more than the sword, and perhaps it was heavier.
Because at the end of a battle, the warrior could sleep,
But the chronicler, he remained awake,
reliving.
and trying somehow to protect others from the memory that haunted him. Inside the walls, glory could not be seen. Echoes could be seen. Those who returned from battles had something broken in their eyes.
Something that could not be fixed with blessings,
Many monks spent hours listening, just listening.
without judging, without responding.
They were like containers, vessels where the suffering of others could rest for a while, and then, perhaps, evaporate. There was no psychology. There was listening,
And faith and a weariness that was not physical, but ancestral,
as if each new crusade were also a cross on the shoulders of those who remained.
and it was not uncommon for the monk, after writing, to simply erase everything, or burn the parchment,
Not out of fear,
but out of compassion, because some horrors did not deserve to continue to exist even on paper, and there were those who preferred to pray rather than record. those who thought that the only worthy story was the one that dissolved in the silence of the candles,
the one that was lost in the wind, and not to the curious eyes of the future.
but even so, many kept writing, because they knew that if no one told, the mistake would return.
And blood would be spilled again.
Between faith and fanaticism, there was an abyss,
And the monks walked across it with cautious steps.
They knew that religion was a home,
But it could also become a weapon, and that hurt.
to see sacred symbols being used as war banners, to see the cross stained with mud and fury,
And yet, to continue believing, not in an institution,
but in a principle,
in something higher than the wars, deeper than the battles.
in a kind of love that didn't need to win to be true, and perhaps that is what still echoes,
The silent courage of those who remained.
of those who saw without closing their eyes, of those who wrote even with their souls bleeding, because sometimes resisting is not forgetting, it is keeping a fragile flame burning, even when everything around you goes dark.
And if you listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear the pen scratching the parchment, slowly, as if asking permission from time,
As if whispering, I saw.
I felt,
And now you can know too,
but calmly, carefully.
and with the peace that only comes when the story is told without haste.
The sound of a bell may be just a warning,
But in certain places and times, it was more than that. It was a lament, a plea, an attempt to talk to the invisible.
after a massacre, when the ground was still dripping and eyes were still twitching, the monks would gather and ring the bells, not to call the faithful,
But to try to purify the air,
as if each chime were a candle lit in the darkness.
a fragile gesture against a silence that was too heavy. It was a way of telling heaven that there were still people trying.
People who were afraid, yes, but also hopeful. There was a specific ritual. They walked in a circle, blindfolded. Each one held a small bell, small, but enough to break the emptiness. The bells rang at different times.
As if each one had their own pain, their own rhythm of healing.
Sometimes the sound was timid, sometimes louder, but never abrupt.
It was a sound that respected.
That apologized, almost, as if to say, forgive, world.
Forgive history.
We didn't know how to stop, and now we only know how to regret.
The curious thing is that, over time, people began to feel the sound before they even heard it.
Like a vibration in the air.
A shiver down their spine. They knew that if the bell rang outside of its scheduled time, something serious had happened. But they also knew that it was the beginning of an attempt to make the world breathe again, to rebuild the bond with the sacred. Because after the blood, more than physical cleansing was needed.
It was necessary to cleanse from within.
And the monks knew that sound had this power, to open invisible doors, to touch places that no words could reach.
They didn't speak during the ritual. They walked in absolute silence. Sometimes the ground was still stained. Sometimes the bodies hadn't been collected yet. And yet they walked, one foot after the other.
As if their own bodies had become part of the prayer, as if each step were a musical note in a melodyless song.
And each chime, a tear that slipped from time.
A plea for peace thrown into the air.
No answer, perhaps.
But with the hope that someone on some plane was listening. After the ritual, they returned to the cloister in silence.
Some cried, others just sat and breathed, as if something had subsided that they could not name. The bells still echoed inside them, a subtle vibration that took a while to pass.
But it did not bother them. It was like the sound of a heart trying to remember its own rhythm, trying to align itself with life again.
The prayer came later.
But there was no need for words.
The sound that hung in the air was enough.
Like an invisible embrace between those who stayed and those who left.
The effects of collective trauma were not ignored. Even without modern names, the monks recognized the signs, the empty gaze, the body that did not rest,
The spirit that seemed trapped in another time.
and so the sound of the bell was also a call back, as if to say, it is still today.
You are still here.
Breathe, walk, pray, ring the bell if you need to.
It does not cure everything.
But it starts something, and sometimes what we need most is a beginning. And so each chime became part of the memory,
Not like an open wound.
but like a spa that sings,
Because the bell, more than a tool, was a symbol.
of humanity, of attempt.
Of humility in the face of the incomprehensible.
It was the sound of a time that knew its own fragility, and that, even so, chose to continue.
So if one day you hear a bell in the distance, maybe it is just the wind. Or maybe it is the echo of a time when even sound wanted to heal.
And that, somehow, is still trying.
There are days when everything changes.
Even faith changes its texture. In B's ears, in the summer of 1209, the city was a field of silence after the storm. The invasion spared no one, not the temples, not those who knelt down asking for mercy. When the monks returned, They found the ground where they prayed covered in blood,
the loudspeakers marked by hands that had slipped trying to save themselves.
and the altar, once shining, was now a shadow, a sacred place made profane by human acts. And yet they entered,
With slow steps,
with loud eyes, and with buckets of holy water in their hands. The water, previously used for blessings and baptism, was thrown over bodies, over stains, over memories that were still fresh, but not in a hurry,
with a care that resembled affection.
like someone trying to wake a brother without scaring him.
Each movement was a prayer.
Each drop, a disguised tear. The monks did not speak. They simply poured the water gently, as if, by touching the cold skin, they could restore a little dignity to those who had left in chaos. It was a gesture of resistance, of saying, here, there is still something sacred.
They also washed themselves,
Not out of disgust, but out of spiritual necessity.
because touching so many bodies, feeling the weight of so much death, left invisible marks.
The holy water on one's own forehead was more than a ritual. It was a request,
That it would not remain trapped inside.
that the pain would not turn into a stone in one's chest.
There were monks who cried in silence as they wet their own eyes. They said the water burned,
But not because of impurity,
out of remembrance, because, at that moment, everything hurt.
even faith. There were those who questioned, is it possible to purify the impure?
But for them, that question didn't matter.
The gesture was what mattered, the attempt, the repeated movement of cleaning the floor, even knowing that the blood would appear again the next day.
It was a cyclical ritual, and also a silent mourning.
The temple had been stained, but not abandoned.
And each damp cloth, each splash, each spilled drop, was a way of saying, we are still here. We still believe.
Even among the ruins, the smell of the place changed.
First it was iron, sweat and fear, then vinegar, incense and herbs,
And finally, just silence.
a dense silence,
Of marble and dust. The candles were lit again.
but they were shaking, not only because of the wind, but as if they felt ashamed of illuminating so much suffering.
The monks walked slowly, some barefoot, feeling the cold ground beneath their feet, as if they wanted to remind themselves that they were alive, and that living at that moment was an act of courage. The temple gradually resumed its shape, but it was never the same again.
Something had changed in the soul of the place, and in the eyes of those who prayed there.
People no longer prayed for miracles,
They prayed for strength,
for lucidity, for a little peace,
and with each prayer, a new gesture of washing, as if the prayer needed water.
as if redemption was running down the walls, slowly, in silence, wetting time.
Softening memories.
And when, finally, everything seemed clean, the monks stopped.
They sat on the floor,
They looked around.
and they said nothing, because they knew that true cleanliness did not lie in the shine of the marble,
But in the intention of not forgetting,
in the courage to reoccupy the space with kindness.
with gratitude, with care. And so, on that day when the holy water turned into tears, a new kind of faith was also born, one that did not need to be tasted,
Only felt.
like a trickle of water on the skin, cold, but healing. Winter arrived without asking permission.
And when he touched the stones of the monastery, everything slowed down.
The wind was bitter, but it was the memory that chilled him the most. On certain days, there were so many bodies of the dead that there was nowhere to put them.
Piled up under improvised tarps, they waited for graves that could not keep up with the pace of death.
And the rain did not help. It fell thinly, constantly, like a cry from the sky.
It washed their pale faces, their stiff hands, their stained robes, and the monks were there,
Standing,
with numb fingers, repeating prayers between one shiver and the next. They knew that the pain was not just physical. It was as if the world itself was in penance.
the wet earth made burial difficult. The shovel slipped, the feet sank,
And the eyes,
did not look away.
because to look away would be to betray those who could no longer look.
So they looked,
Fixedly, with respect, with regret. Some sang, with trembling voices, almost whispered.
hymns that asked for no explanation, just rest, for the bodies, and for the souls.
It was as if the sky was in mourning too,
The sound of rain echoed through the cloisters, creating a sad kind of music.
a natural soundtrack for the end of a season of hope.
The corridors were damp, the cells were colder than usual,
And the monks wore heavy robes, but they couldn't keep warm.
because the cold came from within, from a place that wall couldn't reach. It was the cold of helplessness, of knowing that no matter what they did, it would never be enough.
Death had won once again.
Still, they continued. They collected bodies. They scrubbed the floor.
They lit candles.
They sang, not out of obligation, but out of an almost instinctive need to restore some dignity to those moments. Each gesture was a form of gentle resistance.
And an attempt at forgiveness, because many there wondered what they could have done different.
what they failed to say, to do, to prevent. It was the winter of the regretful, not because they were directly to blame, but because they felt that the world as a whole had failed. The monks' hands would swell, they would turn red, they would often crack, and yet they would not stop. They would not wear gloves, as if they wanted to feel every part of what they were touching. The ice was also a reminder that they were alive, and that while they lived, they needed to care for those who could no longer protect themselves. It was a form of honor, a final offering of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. They knew no one would see it, that there would be no record, but they did it anyway. At night, when they returned to the monastery, the bells did not ring. It was as if even they were in mourning. The silence stretched on for hours. Only the sound of water running down the corners of the windows, and the prayers continued, slow, more spaced out, as if each word needed to overcome the cold to exist. Some monks fell asleep on the floor, exhausted, with their faces still damp. They dreamed of dry fields, of sun, of hugs they had not given, and sometimes they woke up with the feeling that something had been forgiven, but they did not know what. And so that winter went on, with its grey days, its nameless dead, and its silent cares, a time when faith was tested not with doubts, but with weariness. And yet it remained, not as a certainty, but as a gesture, as a soft song, as a body bent over before that which cannot be understood, because, in the end, perhaps it was not about understanding, but about staying there, amidst the rain, the corpses, and the hope that, somewhere, the warmth would return. After the violence, there was a different silence, an emptiness that could not be filled with words or prayers, and the monks, even exhausted, knew that there was one more act to be done, fasting, not as an imposed penance, but as an intimate response. It was as if the body was saying, I could not accept food while so many were forcibly taken from the table. For days, the food remained untouched in the pots, the wooden spoons lay clean, and the refectory became a temple of absence, of respect, of unspoken pain. The silence was absolute. No one asked who would fast. No one asked, but everyone knew. Some only drank water, others nothing. They sat at the table as usual, but without serving themselves. And that was enough. It was a shared gesture, a pain shared between brothers who understood that eating at that moment would be like forgetting too quickly, like moving forward without looking back. And they wanted to remember, at least for one more day, at least until their hearts accepted the warmth of bread again. There in the refectory was different, thicker, almost still. The smell of vegetable soup, when it appeared, seemed embarrassing, as if it were apologizing for existing. And stomachs did growl, yes, but no one was ashamed of it, because that sound was, in a way, also a prayer. Hunger became part of mourning, a physical way of carrying what the soul could no longer hold on its own. And there, in the shadows of the cloister, the monks fasted for everyone, for the living and the dead, for those who had left without saying goodbye. There was a kind of beauty in it, a raw delicacy, a body that refused to be nourished until the soul could breathe peacefully again. It was as if each spoonful of absence was an attempt at redemption, a way of saying, we still feel, we still care. The world may go on, but inside, we are still in that moment. And that gesture, so silent, spread. It inspired. Even the youngest, inexperienced in grief, learned the language of fasting, not taught, just lived. Sometimes during those days, the monks would write more, or meditate for a long time before the candles. The prayers would take on a different rhythm, slower, more hesitant, as if each word had to pass through the empty body before touching the divine. And yet, there was faith, a faith that did not shout, that did not show itself, but that trembled there, in the middle of the stomach, in the weak warmth of the hands, and in the dull glow of the eyes. Because believing, at that moment, was simply continuing to breathe. Over time, the appetite returned, but never all at once. First, a piece of bread, then, perhaps, a warm broth, always with ceremony, as if each bite were a reconnection with life, a subtle permission to move on. And even when the food was already on the plates, people still ate in silence, because the memory was still there, sitting at the table, in the form of absence, in the form of longing, in the form of respect, and silence continued to be part of the meal. And so, fasting was not just a ritual, it was a language, a way of saying what one could not say, and above all, an attempt to sustain the world with one's own emptiness, because there are times when eating feels wrong, and choosing not to eat is all one can do to remain human. And then, in time, food would taste good again, and the body would be grateful again. But it never forgot, because fasting left its mark, not on the stomach, but on the soul. And now, the soul was more sensitive, more alert, more alive.
There was a monk who wrote every day. His hands were steady, his eyes alert.
But after a certain massacre, something changed. He began to cover his eyes while he wrote, not out of vanity,
Nor superstition.
but because he could no longer bear to look. The image of the destruction was still fresh in his mind. The blood on the church steps, the bodies piled up next to the wooden benches, the muffled sound of those still breathing amidst the rubble.
He saw it all, and as he tried to record it, he realized that his eyes were tired of seeing. Then he covered them with a piece of dark cloth. He sat in front of the blank parchment, with his quill already dipped in ink,
And he began. From memory, from pain, from intuition, the text flowed differently, more hesitant, more poetic at times.
as if each word was being groped in the dark. He said that this way he wrote with his heart, that what is seen too much is lost.
But what is felt remains.
Some monks found it strange, others simply respected it, because they knew that the cloth was not a barrier
It was protection.
for what was inside,
The manuscripts were stained, not just with ink,
but with pauses that were too long,
with letters that trembled.
with passages interrupted for no apparent reason, as if the thought was swallowed up by the memory.
And sometimes it was.
He said that writing was harder than praying, because the prayer was lost in the air.
But the written word remained. It was stone. It was witness. And some witnesses no longer wanted to remember. There were entire pages covered by a single line. Today, I preferred not to see, and that was enough.
He wrote with his back to the field. I would never return to the place all happened. He said that the parchment felt it too.
That you couldn't force the paper to receive horrors. You had to be delicate. You had to ask permission from the page, as if each letter were a drop that weighed down your heart.
And over time, other monks began to understand. They too began to write more carefully, with more silence, with less desire to narrate everything, and more desire to preserve the essential.
What hurt? What trembled? What still breathed?
Some manuscripts from this period were lost,
Burned, hidden, forgotten.
but those that remain carry a kind of shadow,
Not in the text, but in the blank space, in what was not said.
in what was left unwritten.
And therein lies the most authentic pain.
The absence, the space left by a scream that did not fit.
A gap of silence between two words that never met again. And the reader, even without knowing it, feels it, that there was something heavy there, and that it was respected enough not to be forced to exist on paper. The chronicler's eyes, even when covered, saw more than many,
Because they saw with their whole body, with a tired soul.
with a raw heart, and that made his texts as small monuments of silent pain. No graphic description,
No attempt to shock.
just gestures, aromas, pauses, and that was enough to recreate the world,
A wounded world, but still sacred, still worthy of being remembered.
even with closed eyes. And so he continued, writing little by little, always in the dark, always carefully, like someone holding something too fragile to be exposed to light. And perhaps by closing his eyes, he could see better. He could see not only what was,
But what was left, what still pulses silently in the cloisters, in the books, in the memories of those who dare to tell stories even when everything seems like noise. And there, in that blind writing, there was more light than in many visions.
not every smell can be explained. Some do not come from the body. They come from something that lingers, that remains even after cleansing, even after time. The monks believed that violent death had a smell of its own, an odor that was not only physical, but spiritual,
They said that when someone died of anger or fear, the soul left a trail.
and that this trail permeated the hallways, the cloths, the books, a smell that could not be recognized, but could be felt, like a chill.
Like an uneasiness that started at the back of the neck and went down to the stomach.
That's why the monastery corridors were filled with incense.
Rosemary, myrrh, lavender, camphor,
Each plant had a function, a promise, and the air became thick.
almost visible.
But that's what they wanted, for the smell of the wounded soul to be lost in the perfume of the herbs. It was a form of protection, not against the dead,
But against what they left behind.
Trauma had a smell, they said, and it needed to be purged. They breathed deeply, even when the incense stuck their eyes, as if the oxygen there came from another world.
There were monks who fainted,
Not because of weakness, but because of excess, because the body reacted. The sense of smell captured what the other senses still denied.
and then came the prayers,
Not spoken, thoughtful,
as if each breath were a request for purification. Faith mingled with the air.
to the point that one no longer knew where the perfume ended and hope began. Some monks believed that, by breathing in incense, they were inhaling light.
Absorbing what was sacred in the air.
And in this way, they protected the soul, even if the body suffered. The relationship between smell and sin was profound.
A very strong,
very present odor was seen as a sign of something resolved, of a presence that still lingered. That is why, even days after a massacre, the monks continued to burn herbs. They left smoking pots in the corners of the corridors, on the altars, in the cells. The entire monastery smelled of a mixture of burnt flower in the past, a past that resisted, and that needed to be negotiated, softened, and soothed by the daily ritual of purification. Breathing became a conscious act, a spiritual gesture, as if the air carried messages, warnings, requests for help. Monks became translators of the invisible, and over time, they learned to distinguish the smells. The smell of guilt, the smell of sadness, the smell of liberation. They didn't talk about it openly. It was a silent knowledge, shared in looks, gestures, in the choice of plants used each day. And even the most skeptical gave in, because, somehow, everyone felt it, that there was something more in the air, something that couldn't be dissipated by the common wind. They said that fear also smells, and that, often, it was the smell itself that brought back the memory. A corner, a hallway, a forgotten tunic. Anything could trigger the memory. And again, the incense, like a barrier, like an invisible embrace. It was a daily struggle against what could not be seen, but it was carried, and there was no certainty that it would work. But there was faith, and that, most days, was enough to keep going, to breathe again, to trust that, little by little, the air would become light again. And so they breathed, carefully, with reverence, with a kind of fear that didn't paralyze, but taught respect, because they knew that they weren't just dealing with what was outside, but with what was inside, and the scent of the soul that doesn't go away easily, but it can be transformed, with time, with prayer, and with a handful of herbs burning slowly, while outside the world still learns to name its pain. What hurts is not always what happens. Sometimes it is what you see. And on a moonless night, soldiers broke through the gates of the convent. They did not come with words. They came with steel. The silence was broken by short, sharp screams that soon died away. Monks were dragged. Priests pushed against the altars, relics broken in half. The sacred became a scene of horror. And in the midst of it all, one monk remained, alive, hidden, with his eyes closed, not for fear of what they might do to him, but of what they were already doing to the others. He stayed like that for 3 days, lying among the remains of wood, covered in clods that smelled of wax and old dust. He didn't move. He didn't open his eyes, because he knew that if he saw it, he wouldn't forget it. And he had seen too much already. The sounds came filtered, muffled, but they were enough. The sound of a body falling, of a breath cut off in mid-air, of footsteps that hesitated, as if searching for more victim. And in the darkness beneath his eyes, the monk prayed, not with articulate words, but with short repetitions, like an anchor that held him to life. He later said that his closed eyes were like a wall between him and the abyss, that to see, at that moment, would be to continue dying even after everything was over. And perhaps he was right, because there are images that stick, that do not go away, not even with time, not even with forgiveness. They are visual wounds, scars of the soul made of light and form. That is why he chose not to see, not out of cowardice, but out of wisdom, because he knew that the real challenge would come later, when the silence returned, and he would have to live with what he imagined. When the convent was empty, he came out of hiding, his eyes still closed. He touched the walls with his fingertip. Each texture told him where he was. The cold of the stone, the roughness of the broken wood, the smell of blood still fresh. He walked like this to the small chapel. He stopped in front of the altar, and only there, after long minutes, did he open his eyes, not to see, but to tell the world, I am here, I still exist, and even though everything seems lost, I am still able to look at the light. What he saw made him cry, not only for the lives taken, but for the silence that remained, a silence that seemed to accuse, to ask why. He had no answers, but he had gestures, and then, slowly, he began to light candles, cleaning the benches, collecting fragments of what was once whole. Each action was a lament, but also an affirmation. Life goes on, even among ruins, even with blurred eyes, even when the heart asks not to remember. For days, he avoided mirrors, not out of vanity, but because he was afraid of recognizing in his own eyes the images he tried not to see. There was a shadow there, a new weight, but also a strange serenity, that of someone who saw without seeing, that of someone who was touched by horror, but chose to keep it within limits. Because sometimes the only way to protect the soul is to spare the eyes, to let the body see with another part, with touch, with hearing, with time. And so he lived, gradually relearning how to see, carefully, with ceremony. He never looked at the altar the same way again. nor at men, nor at himself, but he carried a light certainty, like a breeze on a cold afternoon. Seeing is important, but choosing the moment to see, that can save. And in that abbey, where the screams had already died away, there was now a calm gaze, a gaze that knew the price of remaining open. Not all art is born of beauty. Some are born of the need to remember, and to not go mad. In certain monasteries, after wars, plagues, and massacres, the monks were faced with something impossible to ignore. Bones, many, piled up, repeated, anonymous. The floor could not hold so many bodies, and the soul did not know where to put them either. It was then that another form of prayer emerged, not with words, but with structure, with form, with care. Ossuaries were born, altars made not of gold, but of ribs, of skulls, of fragments of someone who had once been someone. The idea was not to scare, it was to welcome, it was to provide rest. Instead of burying and forgetting, the monks gathered the bones into pattern, architectures of silence, rosettes of tibias, rows of jawbones, not for morbid pleasure, but because each bone was a name, a fragment of history, and letting them get lost in the damp ground seemed wrong. So they gave form to mourning. They created beauty where before there had been only astonishment. And upon entering one of these places, the visitor did not feel fear. They felt weight, a respect that made one's breath slow. Each altar of bones was different. Some were more symmetrical, others were more spontaneous, but they all had something in common: silence, an almost solid silence, as if the walls were listening, and perhaps they really were. The hands that touched those bones knew they were in contact with the sacred, not with the divine in the classical sense, but with the human, with what remains after everything passes, with what insists on remaining, even when the flesh has been taken away by time. Some monks would spend hours in these spaces, cleaning, reorganizing, lighting candles, sometimes just sitting on the floor and looking, as if they were listening to stories, old voices, laughter that would never come back. It was a space for meditation, but also for coping. There, trauma took shape, and as it took shape, it could be touched. It could be, little by little, accepted, not as something good, but as something that existed, and that needed to be looked at with tenderness. It was common to leave dried flowers among the bones, sprigs of lavender, small handwritten notes, as if that would soften the pain, as if to say, you were remembered, even without a name, even without a face. And perhaps that was the true meaning of an altar of bones. Not the visual impact, but the gesture of remembering without needing to know, loving without needing to touch, respecting without needing to understand. Each curve of the femur was a curve of history, of memory, of someone who once also felt cold, hungry, and had faith. The aesthetics of death became a form of spiritual catharsis there. There was no gold, there was no music, just bones and dim light. But that was enough. The altar was beautiful, yes, but not in the traditional sense. It was beautiful because it mattered, because it sustained, because it allowed pain to exist in a concrete way, for the invisible to gain structure. And so, whoever entered there did not leave the same. They left lighter, or fuller. It's hard to say, but something changed. And perhaps that is what the monks wanted, that the pain would not be lost, that it would be transformed, not into weight, but into space, into prison, into symbol, because to forget would be to repeat. And to remember, remembering can save, even if it is through an altar made of bones, an altar that silently sings the name of each one, even those whose names we will never know, because, deep down, we all belong to the same choir, and each bone is a note that still resonates softly in the memory of time. The ground also holds memories, and there are soils that do not dry out, even when the sun insists. Around certain monasteries, the fields seemed to breathe pain, not because they screamed, but because they whispered with each step. The earth was dark, clay mixed with ancient blood. With each rain, the mud gained color, and the monks, even accustomed to the routine of the days, stepped there carefully, as if the ground itself asked for silence, as if each footprint was a violation of something sacred and still in mourning. They walked barefoot, not out of habit, but by choice. They felt the texture of the earth, the coldness of the humidity, and sometimes what seemed like stones were bones, fragments of a time that had not yet passed. The monks knew this, and so, before entering the monastery, they washed their feet. They used vinegar and salt, a simple solution, but it burned, and this burning was part of the ritual, a slight pain, as if the body also wanted to remember that, even without a wound, there was something to purify. The feet were cleaned in silence, one by one, as if it were a private mass. The water ran dark, not because of the visible dirt, but because of the memory it carried. It was a repeated gesture, almost meditative, an offering, a way of saying, I came from there, but I entered here in another way. The monastery was a refuge, but not a separation.
And the monks knew that the pain of the world was in their clothes, in their hands, in their eyes.
And above all, under their feet. It wasn't about obsession, nor guilt. It was more of a deep respect.
An acknowledgement that the ground also feels.
That the ground keeps the echoes of what fell upon it.
That every drop of blood spilled there, no matter how small, changed the landscape.
And so, no one ran. No one spoke loudly.
Sandals were left aside.
The direct contact of skin with the earth was like a conversation.
A listening.
A prayer without words. And silence walked along with it. Some said the ground still seemed to pulse, not as an illusion,
but as a prison. As if beneath the mud there was still untold story. Cries that had never found an ear. And by stepping there, the monk became part of it. A witness. A link between now and then.
And even when the flowers grew again, the smell of the damp earth still reminded him.
Still told him. He still carried the weight of what had happened there.
In the monastery, the cloths used to dry the feet were kept. They were not washed with the others, not out of superstition,
but out of consideration, because they knew that the cloth had touched the past. It had listened, in some way, to the stories that the earth told.
And these cloths were then carefully burned.
As a release, as a possible end to a memory that did not want to become a burden.
Just a memory, just a gesture. And so, the ground remained there.
In no hurry to dry, in no hurry to forget.
And the monks continued to walk on it, calmly.
With reverence, because they knew that, even without plaques or monuments, that field was a memorial.
A sacred space shaped not by sculptors, but by footsteps.
And each footprint, each slow footprint, was also a prayer. An attempt to say, I saw, I felt, and now I move on. But with lighter feet and a heart more attentive to what beats beneath the earth.
There were days when Mass would begin but not end. Not for lack of faith, but for excess of pain. The monks would gather as usual.
Candles lit. Incense rising in slow spirals, sacred words echoing between the cold walls. But something hung in the air, a tension that did not come from the present, but from what had happened before. It was as if the temple remembered, as if each chant echoed back recent memories.
And then, in the middle of a reading or a chant, silence would fall, heavy,
final, as if even God had withdrawn for a moment.
Some monks fainted.
Others simply stopped speaking. Their voices faltered, their bodies trembled.
And the liturgy, which was so familiar, became unattainable.
Like a broken bridge over a turbulent river.
The words of the rite came out crooked. They hesitated.
As if they knew that, at that moment, they could not touch the divine without first going through the pain. And the eyes of those present sought support in each other.
But there was little to do. Just breathe, wait, accept that this Mass would not be like the others.
It wasn't a lack of preparation. There were too many memories. The image of fallen brothers in the cloister.
The smell of newly collected bodies. The traces of blood still visible in the corners of the altar.
And above all, the weight of what could not be prevented. Celebrating in the face of this required more than faith. It required a strength that sometimes did not come.
And that was okay. The monks knew. They had learned that the liturgy, to be true, needed to be human. And that humanity, at that moment, was too wounded to sustain the words until the end.
Time stood still. No one left. No one stayed. They stayed there, sitting, standing, in silence. Some closed their eyes.
Others looked at the ground, as if they were searching for a stability in the cold stone that their spirit could not find. And so, even without an end, that Mass happened in a different way.
More intimate, more honest.
Because faith, at that moment, was to continue being present even without being able to pronounce the sacred names. It was to accept the unfinished, the interrupted.
That which trembles and cannot be sustained. Then, sometimes hours later, someone would blow out the candle. Someone else would put away the books.
No one would talk about what had happened. There was no need.
Because everyone knew.
They had felt the same thing.
A lump in the throat that could not be removed with words. An emptiness in the chest that could not be filled with songs. But that still needed to be respected.
And respect, in that place, manifested itself in the permission to stop, to not force.
To let time heal little by little.
The following Masses were different.
More leisurely, more gentle.
As if they were feeling their way back to normality. But never exactly as before.
Because something had changed. A new vulnerability hung in the air.
And with it, a deeper kind of reverence.
Not only for God,
but for humanity.
For what feels,
For what hesitates.
for what never ends. And the monks understood that this was also prayer. That silence in the face of pain was sometimes truer than the most beautiful psalm.
And so they went on.
With unfinished masses.
With hesitant faith.
With prayers that shook more than they healed. But they went on, because they knew that, in the end,
the sacred can also be imperfect, that there is beauty in the attempt, that there is communion even in failure, and that, perhaps, those masses that no one could finish were the closest to the divine. At night, the smell rose, not with the wind, but with the silence. Through the abbey window, the monks felt the invisible presence of the wounded city. It was no longer corpses before their eyes. It was the air. The air brought a constant reminder that the world outside was still bleeding. And even with the doors closed, the pain crept in, slowly, persistent. The corridors filled with an aroma that the monks called the weight. They could not explain it, but they could feel it. It was something between the dampness of the earth, rotting flesh, and a kind of absence. An absence with a smell. To endure, they improvised. They slept with cloths soaked in herbs under their noses. Lavender, eucalyptus, sage leaves, sometimes chamomile. The smell of the plants competed with that of the world. It was a form of sensory resistance. Not an escape, but a relief. A simple gesture that said, I still want to feel something else. I still want to sleep with the hope that the air might be light. And even if it wasn't, the monks tried. A folded cloth, a deep breath, an exhausted body, and sleep came. Or at least a possible rest. Some people placed small branches under their pillows. Others hung dried bunches on their beds. The most sensitive preferred to cover their heads with a cloak. They created a cocoon, a bubble of silence and neutral smell. It was a delicate struggle, a nightly battle against habit, because the greatest fear was not feeling. It was getting used to it, getting used to the smell of tragedy, to the heavy air, to the world in ruins, and gradually losing the ability to perceive, to react, to mourn. The smell of death was nothing new, but now it was constant, and that made it more dangerous. It was no longer a shock. It was a permanent background, an olfactory trail that accompanied the days, and the monks knew that if they didn't take care of it, the smell would stop bothering. It would become part of their daily lives, invisible, insensible, and with that, something precious would be lost. Compassion, connection, amazement in the face of suffering, everything that made faith alive. There were reports of monks who would wake up at night, sweating, even in the cold. They said they had dreamed of the city, of the empty streets, of the dead who came asking for shelter. They didn't speak. They just looked. And even when they were asleep, the monks knew that the smell was there, inside the dream, like an ancient presence that wouldn't let go. And when they woke up, the first thing they did was look for the scented cloth, press it against their face, breathe deeply, and try to remember that there was still something sweet in the world. Some began to write about it, not in treatises, but in small passages in the corners of the parchments. Phrases like today, the smell was stronger, or the wind brought the pain again. They were invisible diaries, discreet confession, because there were things that did not fit into the liturgy, but they needed to come out somehow, and writing was a way of keeping the sensitivity alive. It is worth remembering that, even surrounded by tragedy, the heart could still perceive the scent of a flower, and that, in itself, was already a miracle. And so, the abbey breathed. Through the window, the world entered, but inside, there was resistance, tried herbs, long breaths, chosen silence, and a faith that did not seek miracles but relief. Relief to continue feeling, to not harden inside. Because more than the smell of death, what hurt them most was the smell of losing faith. And against this, the monks fought, with cloths, with prayers, with small gestures, so that, each night, the air would still bring a little hope. Some nights seemed longer, not because of the time, but because of the weight. On those nights, the monks turned to the rosary, but not as an automatic ritual. It was something deeper, a thread that connected the present to the invisible. The dark wooden beads slid between their fingers, one by one, and each movement was a request, or a memory, or just a silent wish that the world would make sense again. They didn't rush, they didn't count, they just kept going, as if there was no end, and in a way, there really wasn't. There were monks who would spend hours like this, sitting under the dim light of a candle, their eyes closed, their bodies motionless, only the almost imperceptible sound of the beads touching each other. It was a soft sound, comforting, like a whisper repeated in the night. And in that silence, each Hail Mary became an anchor, an attempt to not sink into the dark sea of tiredness, pain, and hopelessness. Because to repeat was to survive. To repeat was to keep the heart beating at a rhythm the soul could still bear. Sometimes they didn't say the words out loud. They just thought. Other times, they murmured softly, like someone talking to someone who has already passed away. Each bead on the rosary was an unspoken name, a forgotten face, a memory that insisted on coming back. And even though their fingers hurt, they kept going, because stopping was like waking up from a dream that hurt less than reality. It was a prayer that asked for nothing, just presence, just continuity.
Just a truce.
Some rosaries were smooth, worn from use,
Others were handmade, with irregular beads.
but they all carried a story of faith, of fear, of trying, because the rosary was not just an object.
It was a map.
A path that the mind could follow when the body no longer wanted to move, and walking inside was sometimes the only way to go.
To not stop completely.
To keep a part alive while the rest tried to heal. The movement was always the same, but never the same.
Because each night brought a different pain,
A different longing, a new doubt, and the rosary adapted to this. It was flexible, it was patient,
it was a constant presence when everything else seemed to slip away.
and the monks knew that,
Even if the words were lost, the gesture was still valid.
the intention was greater than the form, and the soul, even without understanding, was grateful. Some people fell asleep holding the rosary,
Their fingers still wrapped around the last beads, as if the prayer had ended.
and maybe it hadn't.
Because there were things that didn't end with sleep, they continued.
In the dream, in the body, in the silence that remained in the room after the candle went out, and the rosary there, next to them, was a reminder that the sacred can be simple. It can be repetition. It can be just being. And so the nights passed, not measured by the clock, but by the beats.
By breathing, by the light that slowly faded. The endless rosary was not a mistake.
It was a choice. To keep praying even when there was nothing to pray for. To keep feeling even when everything was numb.
To keep remembering, with love, what hurt. Because, deep down, repeating is a way of loving. And loving, in that abbey, was the longest prayer of all.
There was a custom that few people knew about. In the days following a massacre, some monks would write letters.
Not to authority, nor to official record.
They were letters addressed to the families of the victim,
To the children who would never know what happened.
to the mothers who never received a body, to the wives who would sleep waiting for someone who would never return. The monks wrote as if they were speaking to time,
With a love that was not theirs, but which they welcomed instinctively.
and at the end, they folded the letters carefully.
But they did not send them.
They were burned in small hidden fires, not out of fear, but by choice.
Because they knew that, when they arrived, those words might cause more pain than comfort. And there was something sacred in letting the fire read it first, letting it take the message to another place.
A place where, perhaps, souls could understand.
It was a writing that sought no answer, nor justice. It was a mourning that was done in silence, with ink, paper, and slow flames.
Each letter had its own weight. Some began with names, others with mementos.
Subtle descriptions.
A sentence like "his eyes were open" could contain the world, and even without an addressee, the monks put it all there.
What they saw,
What they felt, what they couldn't stop,
and above all, what they wished they had said. Words that didn't fit in the Psalms,
or in the masses,
but that found shelter on the page.
at least for a while. Writing was a way of touching what could no longer be touched, of prolonging one's presence, of offering, even if in secret, a gesture of care,
As if to say, you have not been forgotten.
I saw you.
I felt your absence, and even if no one speaks your name anymore, it echoes in me.
And then, before the pain became too great, the fire, the gentle fire,
Not of destruction.
but of transformation, of surrender, of passage.
Some monks kept ashes, small envelopes with fragments of letters.
They didn't show them to anyone,
They just knew they were there,
and that was enough. It was like carrying a part of history in their pocket,
like an invisible reliquary.
a secret between them and those who were absent. And in the most difficult moments, they would write again.
New letters,
New silences.
new controlled files.
It was a cycle.
A discreet way of keeping alive the connection with those who had already passed.
There was no liturgy for this,
No rules,
no official blessing,
but everyone knew and respected it.
because writing was a sacred act. Even if ephemeral, even if secret, the parchment was the confessor,
The fire, the confidant,
and the monk just a link.
between what was and what still beats, between pain and delicacy, between words and silence.
And perhaps in these letters that never arrived lies hidden the purest form of prayer. And so the nights passed, with the smell of burned parchment, with fingers stained with ink, with eyes tired from remembering,
But also with a heart a little lighter.
because I had spoken, even if no one listened, even if the paper no longer existed, even if the words had been carried away by the hot wind of the embers. And in that act, simple and intimate, there was a hope that somewhere, someone had read it.
And understood it.
There was a time when monks prayed not to remember, but to forget. They closed their eyes tightly.
They repeated the sacred words as if to cover the noises of memory. They did not ask for miracle. They asked for silence within.
A silence deeper than that of the cloister, thicker than that of dawn. They prayed to erase images, faces, screams, the sound of swords against the altar, the memory of warm blood running between the choir boards. It was a kind of prayer that was not taught in books, but that was born of weariness. Some asked God to take away their night vision, that they would no longer dream, that their minds would become empty spaces, like empty cells. Others begged for selective forgetfulness, that they would only remember the flowers, the psalms, the peaceful faces, but their brains would not obey. And so prayer became a refuge, a place where the monk could place his pain and leave it there for a while. Like someone who places a burden on an invisible altar. There were days when prayer was just a repeated word, without meaning, without form, just sound, like the babbling of a child, like a soft wind against the walls of time. And yet, it was prayer, because it came from a place of truth, from a calm desperation, from a subtle desire to continue existing without carrying so much weight. They knew that forgetting completely would be impossible, but there were degrees of remembering, and sometimes that was all they asked for, to remember less, not out of indifference, but out of survival, because remembering too much is like breathing heavy air, and the spirit, already wounded, needs lightness to carry on. That's why the prayers took on a slower rhythm, almost a lament, words that glided carefully, like someone treading on fragile ground. And the monks gradually learned to deal with this new form of faith, a faith that didn't demand answers, that didn't promise a cure, but that offered companionship. They spoke little among themselves about it, but a look was enough, a gesture, a deeper sigh at the end of a prayer. Everyone knew, everyone carried too many images, and even those who seemed more serene had their sleepless nights, their mornings when the light was not enough. And that was when prayer became more precious, because it was not made of certainties, but of attempts to make the mind a little more habitable. Some wrote short sentences on pieces of paper. Forgetting is also a kind of forgiveness. Others carved small symbols into the wood of the bench, personal rituals, like anchors for moments of inner turmoil. And in these gestures, however small, there was something grand, an honest recognition of one's own fragility, and a gentle trust that time, together with faith, might soften what the world had left so harsh. And so, the prayer was transformed from supplication to consolation, from lament to song, from heaviness to breeze, because praying to forget was not giving up. It was choosing which part of the pain to carry on, which to let rest. And in the silence of the cloisters, where the light entered in oblique beams, and the incense still danced in the air, the monks continued, with their eyes closed, not out of denial, but out of care. Because sometimes the heaviest thing is not what one experiences, it is what one remembers. And even that, with time, can become light. With faith, with patience, with silence. It was slow, almost imperceptible. First a flower, then a song. Small signs that something inside the abbey was beginning to... It wasn't joy, not yet, but a timid form of lightness, like a ray of light entering through a forgotten crack. After so much mourning, the monks began to realize that life persisted, even amidst the rubble, even amidst memories. And perhaps that's why, without making a fuss, they began to leave small vases of wild flowers in the hallway. Nothing grand, just a gesture. But that gesture said a lot. The dining room, once so silent, began to have a new sound. The clinking of spoons, a stray phrase, a brief smile between two brothers who had not looked at each other lightly for months. No one forced it. No one asked. But the human body, even when injured, seeks to reorganize itself. The soul, even when tired, seeks new meanings. And faith is still there. Not as a miracle, but as a breath of fresh air, like a breeze that refreshes without us noticing. It was the beginning of something, a reconstruction from within. The rituals had also changed. They were still slow, but now they had softer pauses. Some monks began to sing again, low, harmonious, almost timid voices, as if asking time for permission to rise again. The wine at Mass had a different taste, not because of its flavor, but because of its intention. It was the same liquid, but now it was shared with a different disposition. Less guilt, more presence, more gratitude for still being there, for still being able to touch, feel, breathe. And over time, the spaces of the abbey began to breathe again. The walls, which had been dark, were covered in new cloths. The candles were lit again with delicacy, not only with sadness. And the monks began to walk with less hunched steps, not because they had forgotten, but because they had learned to carry their memories in a different way, like someone who keeps a letter secret, not to hide it, but to protect it from the rush of the world. And somehow, this transformation was visible. Visitors began to arrive, few, discreetly, and they were welcomed with herbal tea and fresh bread. A simple gesture, but loaded with symbolism, because for a long time, The abbey had closed itself off to the world and to itself, and now, little by little, it was reopening its doors, not out of vanity, but out of welcome,
out of the need to share what had been rebuilt.
because healing, when shared, grows stronger. And the monks knew this. They knew that smiling again was not a betrayal of memory. It was a tribute to survival. On one of the calmest nights of that year, the bell rang, but not in mourning, nor as an alarm. It rang slowly, as if lovingly awakening someone asleep. And the monks, upon hearing it, looked at each other in silence. They knew what it meant. It was the sound of life getting back to its rhythm, of routine making sense again, of time saying, "Go on, sing, breathe, embrace." And so they did, without rushing, without promises, just as lightly as possible. And that night, they slept better, not because everything had passed, but because something had begun. Faith now had the color of a flower. It had the sound of low singing. It tasted like warm bread shared between brothers. It was a faith that knew pain, but it also knew laughter.
A light, small laugh that began in the eyes before reaching the mouth.
And perhaps in that moment, the world breathed along with them, in peace, even if for a short time, but long enough to believe again. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath.
Imagine that you are the last monk in that monastery.
There are no more candles lit. Only the moonlight touching the cold stones with an ancient tenderness. The flesh has dried.
The blood has turned to dust.
The walls hold more memories than echoes. But you still hear. You still feel. There is a soft whisper in the air.
Perhaps a last prayer forgotten in the corner of some cloister.
Perhaps just the sound of time passing slowly, as if the whole world were waiting for you to rest. Your body is weightless. It is still, but not rigid.
It is at peace.
You hear the wind blowing through the narrow windows.
It does not bring cold.
It brings memories. It brings the smell of wet earth, of old wood, of worn wax. And for a moment, everything seems to make sense. The nights of vigil, the silent fast, the prayers whispered in the dark. Everything now comes together in a single gesture of surrender, of calm surrender, of acceptance. You remember when the bells rang like screams. Now, they don't ring anymore, but they still vibrate inside you, not as pain, but as a memory, like the beating of an old heart. You smile without showing your teeth, a smile that is only yours, a silent acknowledgement that the journey was long, but you got where you needed to go, and that, even without an audience, it was worth it, because every gesture you made, even the smallest, had meaning. You are not alone. There are soft voices all around you. They do not frighten you. They soothe you. They are the echoes of those who came before, of those who prayed by your side, of those who left in silence. They do not say words, but you understand, because when the eyes close, the soul sees everything, sees beyond, sees what matters. And what matters now is not what was left, but what remains. Peace, lightness, the certainty that love, even in the end, is the last thing to go. Maybe tomorrow others will come. Maybe not. But time doesn't matter anymore. You did your part. You were present. You were a gesture. You were silent. You were faith. And that's enough. Because there are stories that don't need grand endings. They just need to be felt until the end. And now, while the world outside continues its rhythm, you rest. Without fear. Without rushing. Like someone who knows that everything is in its place. And that nothing, really nothing, was in vain. The night advances, but it doesn't scare you. It covers everything with a dark and gentle cloak, like a last embrace, like an invitation to rest, and you accept. You close your eyes once more, but this time in a different way, not to escape, but to surrender, to listen to the last words of the night, words that don't come from outside, but from inside, and that say softly, everything is okay. You can sleep, you can dream, you can go back if you want. I'll be here, whispering other stories, if you want to come back, whenever you need, when the world seems too noisy, when sleep is slow, when the soul wants to remember that silence can also be company. Until then, rest, with lightness, with gratitude, with the certainty that, even when the eyes close, the soul still sees.